She was invited to her ex's wedding, then the groom saw her. The cathedral smelled of white roses and old money, 400 guests, silk gowns brushing marble floors. The kind of morning where everything, the light, the flowers, the perfectly aligned pew ribbons, looked engineered for a portrait. And then there was Vivienne Corbet, sitting 3 rows from the back in a dress that was not white, not ivory, not blush, crimson, not loudly, not aggressively, a deep, bruised red, the colour of ink that hasn't quite dried. She hadn't chosen it to cause a scene. She'd chosen it because it was the only garment she owned that felt honest. A fitted, high-collared gown of her own design, the kind of thing that looked deceptively simple until you understood every seam was a decision. No pearls, no lace, no concession to expectation. The organ played, the guests stood. Vivienne did not stand. She had promised herself she would come, bear witness, and leave. She owed Percy Wyndham nothing. Certainly not performance. He had left her 2 years ago with a polished explanation about compatibility and family, obligations which everyone understood to mean, "You are extraordinary," and that is precisely the problem. The doors at the rear of the cathedral opened. The bride drifted through on a cloud of tulle. Vivienne watched politely. She had already decided she felt nothing. Then Percy Wyndham turned at the altar. He looked, as expected, devastating. Dark coat, shoulders like a man built for portraiture. The Marquess of Wyndham, one of the most eligible men in the new empire, marrying the perfectly suitable Lady Cecily Ford in front of everyone who mattered. His eyes moved, almost reflexively, across the crowd, and stopped. They found her without effort, the way a compass needle finds north. Not because she was trying to be found, but because something in him already knew exactly where she was sitting. The organ continued. The bride drew nearer. The 400 guests saw none of it, because the Marquess of Wyndham had gone very, very still. And seated 3 rows back, in a gown the colour of a held breath, Vivienne Corbet felt the precise moment she realised. She had been wrong. She felt everything. Have you ever convinced yourself you were over someone right up until the moment you saw them again and your whole body called your bluff? Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories about women who refuse to shrink, subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. The new British Empire runs on 2 things: lineage and appearances. It is a world caught between centuries, where Rolls-Royces idle outside Regency, facades, where families still speak of bloodlines at dinner tables, equipped with screens, where a duke may well wear a fitted modern suit, but the rules governing whom he may love remain as ancient and immovable as the stone walls of his estate. Vivienne Corbet, 26, is not from those walls. She is the daughter of a South London tailor who taught her that fabric does not lie, it reveals. She grew up in a narrow house where the table was also the workbench, and she learned to sew before she learned to curtsy. She has the kind of face that people describe as striking rather than pretty, with deep brown skin, sharp cheekbones, natural hair she pins only when she chooses to, and dark eyes that have a habit of seeing things before they happen. She built her fashion house, Corbet, from a single rented studio at 22. By 25, women of the aristocracy were ordering her gowns in secret and crediting unnamed designers at public events. The work was hers. The credit was carefully withheld. She is used to it. Percy Wyndham, 31, is the Marquess of Wyndham and heir to the Dukeship of Norringham. He is broad-shouldered, unhurried in his movements, and possessed of the particular gravity that comes from never having had to shout. He has dark hair, grey eyes, and the kind of jawline that belongs on an old coin. He is not cruel, which makes him more dangerous than the men who are, because his mistakes arrive wrapped in reasonableness. He loved Vivienne Corbet once, privately and entirely, and then he chose his family's expectations instead. Today, at his wedding, something in his chest has gone catastrophically, irreparably sideways. Because the woman he told himself he no longer wanted is sitting 3 rows back in a crimson gown she made with her own hands, and she is not looking at him, which is somehow the most devastating thing he has ever witnessed. Vivienne had arrived 8 minutes before the ceremony, late enough to avoid the greeting line, early enough to secure an exit-adjacent seat. She had dressed with the calm deliberateness of someone preparing for minor surgery. The crimson gown, high collar, clean lines, a single architectural drape at the hip, had taken 3 weeks to construct. She had told herself it was simply the piece she was working on. She had not told herself why she'd finished it the day before Percy's wedding. The cathedral filled with the particular hum of aristocratic restraint. She recognised faces. Lord Fenmore, who had once called her work charming for a newcomer, Lady Alderton, who wore a Corbett piece to every charity gala, but had never once attributed it publicly. The quiet economy of a world that consumed her talent and withheld her name. She kept her expression neutral. She had practiced it. What she had not practiced was Percy turning at the altar and finding her with the instinctive certainty of someone who had spent 2 years pretending not to look for her in crowds. She watched the recognition travel across his face, not a performance of surprise, but something slower, something that began in the eyes and arrived at the jaw like a verdict. The bride was halfway down the aisle. Vivian looked away first. She was very good at that. She focused on her programme, on the weight of the parchment, on the name printed there in copperplate. Percy James Aldous Wyndham and Lady Cecily Ann Ford, the union of 2 ancient families. The correct and rational conclusion to a story Vivienne had briefly, foolishly believed she might be part of. A woman 2 pews ahead turned and looked at her. Then again, the dress. Vivian felt the survey complete itself, the cataloguing, the small confusion, the decision not to approve. She held the woman's gaze for exactly 2 seconds. The woman turned away. That, at least, she had always been good at. The ceremony began. Vivian listened to the words without hearing them and told herself she would be gone before the recessional. She was not. She should have left. She knew this with the same quiet certainty she knew thread counts and fabric weights. And yet, when the cathedral emptied into the pale gold afternoon, and cars began the procession to Norringham House, Vivian found herself in her own car, a sleek, old black Citroën she'd restored herself. Following the convoy through the estate gates, Mara, her assistant and most loyal interrogator, had sent 3 messages. The last read, "Vivienne, why are you still there?" Vivian put her phone face down. The reception was held in the orangery of Norringham House. 40-foot glass ceilings, trailing jasmine, tables arranged with the precision of a military campaign. Champagne arrived before she had located her place card. She almost admired the efficiency. She had been seated at table 14, diplomatically distant from the main family, but present enough to signal that Mrs. Wyndham, Percy's formidable mother, had known exactly what she was doing when she added Vivian to the list. Why had she been invited at all? She had been asking herself this for 6 weeks, since the ivory envelope arrived at her studio with her name written in the Marchioness's own hand. A test, perhaps, a message. And she had turned this possibility over until it lost its shape, a cruelty disguised as courtesy. She was examining a seating card when a voice arrived beside her. Not loud, never loud. You came. Percy. She did not startle. She had heard him approaching, had been aware of him threading through the crowd for the past 4 minutes, with the low-level alertness of someone who had learned in self-defense to track his presence in a room. She looked up. He was close. Closer than was appropriate for a man who had, technically, just married someone else 40 minutes ago. "Your mother invited me," she said pleasantly. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I know." "Congratulations," Vivian added. The bride was lovely. It was not a kindness. It was a border drawn in silk. Percy opened his mouth, closed it. Across the room, Lady Cecily Wyndham, new, radiant, and watching, turned to her mother and said something quietly that made the older woman glance toward table 14. The evening had only just begun. Dorothea Wyndham, the Marchioness Dowager, was 71 years old and had survived 4 political scandals, 2 inheritance disputes, and a daughter-in-law she had personally orchestrated. She wore gunmetal grey to her son's wedding and called it practical. She found Vivienne at the edge of the orangery at 6:15, standing before a wall of climbing roses with a glass of champagne she had not yet touched. "Miss Corbett." Not a greeting, a placement. Vivian turned. "Lady Wyndham." The older woman studied her without pretense. Her eyes travelled from the gown, slowly, with what Vivian recognised as genuine appreciation, to her face. "I designed my first garment at 14, Dorothea said. No one ever knew." Vivian said nothing. She understood the statement was not a confession but an opening. "My son," Dorothea continued, "is not a foolish man. He is, however, a man raised to prioritize the architecture of duty over the fact of feeling. She turned to look across the orangery, where Percy stood speaking with guests, with the perfectly deployed ease of someone who had learned charm as a second language. He has been doing exactly what was required of him since he was 17 years old. "I'm aware," Vivian said. "Are you aware that when I told him to end things with you 2 years ago, he argued with me for the first and only time in his adult life?" Vivian went very still. "I want to tell you that I regret the advice I gave him," Dorothea said. "Not out of sentiment, because I have watched him perform contentment every day since, and I am too old to pretend not to notice." Vivienne set down her champagne with enormous precision. "Why are you telling me this?" The Marchioness Dowager looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and discarded very little. "Because you are the only person in this room dressed honestly," she said, "and I thought you deserved one honest conversation in return." She moved away through the crowd with the unhurried authority of someone who had already done what she came to do. Vivienne stood alone in the jasmine-scented air with a great deal to think about. Dorothea Wyndham, the Marchioness Dowager, was 71 years old and had survived 4 political scandals, 2 inheritance disputes, and a daughter-in-law she had personally orchestrated. She wore gunmetal grey to her son's wedding and called it practical. She found Vivienne at the edge of the orangery at 6:15, standing before a wall of climbing roses with a glass of champagne she had not yet touched. "Miss Corby, a placement." Vivienne turned. "Lady Wyndham." The older woman studied her without pretense. Her eyes travelled from the gown, slowly with what Vivienne recognised as genuine appreciation, to her face. "I designed my first garment at 14, Dorothea said. "No one ever knew." Vivienne said nothing. She understood the statement was not a confession but an opening. "My son," Dorothea continued, "is not a foolish man. He is, however, a man raised to prioritise the architecture of duty over the fact of feeling." She turned to look across the orangery, where Percy stood speaking with guests, with the perfectly deployed ease of someone who had learned charm as a second language. "He has been doing exactly what was required of him since he was 17 years old." "I'm aware," Vivian said. "Are you aware that when I told him to end things with you 2 years ago, he argued with me for the first and only time in his adult life?" Vivian went very still. "I want to tell you that I regret the advice I gave him," Dorothea said, "not out of sentiment, because I have watched him perform contentment every day since, and I am too old to pretend not to notice." Vivian set down her champagne with enormous precision. "Why are you telling me this?" The Marchioness Dowager looked at her with eyes that had seen a great deal and discarded very little. "Because you are the only person in this room dressed honestly," she said. "And I thought you deserved one honest conversation in return." She moved away through the crowd with the unhurried authority of someone who had already done what she came to do. Vivian stood alone in the jasmine-scented air with a great deal to think about. By morning, Vivian had made 3 decisions. First, she would leave Norringham before breakfast. Second, she would not answer Percy's messages, should any arrive. Third, she would finish the collection she had been half building for 8 months and enter it under her own name. No attribution to larger houses, no quiet crediting, no more borrowed visibility, her name, her label, her terms. She was carrying her bag through the entrance hall when the Countess of Alderton's daughter stopped her. "Miss Corbett." Harriet Alderton was 24, newly sharp in the way of people who have recently discovered they possess opinions. She held out her phone. "Is this yours?" On the screen, a photograph already circulating in certain corners of aristocratic social media. Vivian in her crimson gown, seated in the cathedral. In the background, out of focus but identifiable, Percy at the altar, his face turned unmistakably toward her. The caption, written by someone Vivienne didn't know. The dress nobody was supposed to notice. The groom who couldn't look away. 14,000 shares. 240 comments, the first dozen, variations on the theme of scandalous. Vivian handed the phone back. "It's a public event," she said. "Anyone may be photographed." "People are saying you wore red deliberately," Harriet said. Not unkindly, more with the clinical interest of someone watching a play develop, to make a point. "I wore it because I made it," Vivian said, "and it was finished." This was true. It was also she accepted in the privacy of her own chest, not the whole truth. She had known what she was doing when she chose that dress. She had known, and she had gone anyway, because something in her had decided that if she was going to feel the full weight of this day, she was going to feel it in something she had made with her own hands, not performing grief, not swallowed into beige propriety, present, in colour, on her own terms. By the time her car cleared the Norringham gates, the photograph had 41,000 shares. Her phone rang. A number she didn't recognise, she answered. "Miss Corbett," said a woman's voice, crisp as pressed linen. "This is Sophia Vane, editor of the Imperial Review. I wonder if you have 20 minutes. She did not have 20 minutes. She gave them 40. Lady Cecily Wyndham was not a fool. She had been told, 6 months before the wedding, by her own mother, that Percy Wyndham had ended a significant attachment to make himself available for marriage. She had filed this information quietly and behaved as though she hadn't received it, because she was a practical woman who understood that most men of position arrived to marriage carrying some version of this luggage. What she had not anticipated was crimson. She found the photograph on her own phone at breakfast, forwarded by 3 separate people with the energy of those who believe they are delivering news rather than detonating it. She looked at it for a long time, the gown, the face, the particular way Percy had turned at the altar. She had her honeymoon in 3 days. She had a marriage to construct. She had a life she had chosen with the full information available to her. But she was not a fool. She called her oldest friend, the Hon, Rosalind Thatch, who arrived within the hour with the loyalty and clinical precision of a barrister. "He looked at her," Cecily said simply, not accusatorially, factually. "Yes," said Rosalind, "he has never looked at me that way." Rosalind was quiet. "I don't believe he is dishonest," Cecily continued. "I believe he genuinely intends to be a good husband. I believe he is fully capable of behaving exactly as a marquess should." She set down her cup. "I also believe I have married a man who is in love with someone else. What do you want to do?" Cecily was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the estate grounds were silver grey in the morning mist, unchanged since the 17th century. "I want to be honest with myself before I'm dishonest with him," she said finally. "And then I want to think very carefully about what kind of life I actually want." She reached for her phone and looked at the photograph again. The woman in crimson was looking away from Percy, with the focused stillness of someone holding a great deal in. She understood that, at least. The interview ran 11 days later. Sophia Vane was 50, relentlessly perceptive, and had the professional gift of silence. She deployed it at the exact moments when subjects filled the quiet with the truest things they had been, trying to keep diplomatic. Vivian had been warned about this. She spoke carefully and meant most of it. The piece that appeared in the Imperial Review was titled, the name on the label, Vivienne Courbet and the Invisible Architecture of Fashion's New Power. It mentioned the wedding photograph once, in the 3rd paragraph, and only to note that Vivienne had designed the gown herself. Then it moved on. The rest was industry, craft, process. 8 years of work laid out in the unforgiving light of editorial attention. And it named names. It named the houses that had licensed her patterns without attribution. It named the 3 collections that had carried someone else's label over her designs. It named Lord Fenmore's wife, who had worn a Corbett original to the Imperial Benefit Gala, and described it in a subsequent interview as a find from Paris. It was not a scandal piece. It was something more lasting, a correction of record. Vivienne read it in her studio at 7 a.m. with cold tea, and the steady realization that her life was about to reorganize itself. By noon, her assistant had fielded 22 calls. By 4, 2 department heads from major houses had requested meetings. By 6, a message arrived from Dorothea Wyndham. "Well done, Miss Corbett. I have already forwarded it to 12 relevant people." And at 8:17 in the evening, her phone rang with a number she had decided not to answer. She answered. "I read it," Percy said. "I assumed. Viv. Just her name, with a weight in it she couldn't decode. I'm quite busy this week, Percy. I know, I won't. I just wanted to say." A pause. "It was overdue, and it was brilliant, and I'm sorry it took this long for anyone to say it properly." She held the phone. "Thank you," she said. Then, because she was also honest, don't call again for a while. He didn't. For 11 days, she counted. The news arrived not through gossip but through Rosalind Thatch, who called Mara professionally, who told Vivienne directly. Percy and Cecily Wyndham had filed for annulment, quietly through a private solicitor. No statement, no confirmation to press, just the clean legal fact of an undoing. Vivienne sat with this for a long time. She did not feel triumph. She didn't have the appetite for it. She felt something closer to the specific sorrow of watching two people discover, as carefully as possible, that they had tried to build a foundation on a surface that would not hold. She felt something else, too, which she refused to examine immediately. She sent Cecily a note, handwritten, brief, and without reference to any of the specific circumstances. I hope you are well. The strength it takes to be honest is considerable. I hope you give yourself credit for it. She addressed it to Rosalind Thatch's home, sealed it, and sent it before she could decide it was inadequate. 3 days later, she received a reply, also brief. It read, "Thank you. And for what it is worth, you wore the most honest thing in that cathedral, I noticed. See." Vivienne put the letter in the drawer where she kept things she wanted to keep. It was Mara who said, with the directness that justified her employment, "He's going to come and find you now." Probably. What are you going to do? Vivienne was pinning a sleeve. She didn't look up immediately. "I'm going to finish this collection," she said. "Launch it under my name. Open the Corbett house properly. Do the thing I have been building toward for 8 years. And then," she looked up, "and then I'll see where I am, what I want, whether any conversation worth having is available." Mara considered this. That's actually quite mature. I've had a lot of practice being patient, but she was tired of waiting for other people to choose her. The next choice, whatever it was, would be hers. She called it groundwork. Not. Empire. Not. Heritage. Not any of the words that gestured toward a tradition she had always been made to feel adjacent to rather than part of. Groundwork, because everything real begins in it. Because her father had taught her that. Because she had spent 8 years laying foundations in other people's buildings. The launch was held in her studio, converted from a Victorian print house in Bermondsey, exposed brick and north-facing glass, and her name above the door in plain lettering that had taken her 3 weeks to decide not to italicize. The invitations were small, the attendance was not. Dorothea Wyndham arrived in the first car, which Vivienne had not expected and understood immediately as a statement. She wore a Corbett piece, the gunmetal dinner coat from the previous spring, and greeted Vivienne with the single nod of someone who has already decided to be proud of a person and sees no reason for ceremony about it. Sophia Vane came, 3 buyers from international houses. The Countess of Alderton's daughter, Harriet, who had graduated in the past weeks from curious observer to genuine advocate. Rosalind Thatch, who arrived alone and looked at everything with the focused attention of someone scouting on behalf of a client. Percy did not come. Vivienne had not invited him. She had thought about it. She had gone through the whole architecture of reasons why she might, or might not. In the end, she had decided that if he wanted to come, he could ask. She had spent enough time being available in the background. The collection itself spoke for her, as she had always believed clothing should. 12 pieces, each one a different textile tradition translated into entirely modern form, brocade cut into a riding coat, kente pattern in the lining of a silk blazer, printed cotton from her father's shop, remade into a structured column dress. The final piece was the crimson gown, displayed alone on a central form. No description, just a small white card that read, Vivienne Corbett, 2024. The room was quiet around it for a long time. He came on a Tuesday 12 days after the launch, not to the studio, to the print house after hours, when the building was closed and Vivienne was alone, with a lamp and a half-built jacket, and the particular quality of quiet that London makes after 9 in the evening. She heard the knock and already knew. Percy stood in the doorway in a dark coat, no tie, looking like a man who had rehearsed what he was going to say and then abandoned it at the door. She recognized the expression. He used to get it when he was about to tell her something true. "I saw the photographs," he said, "from the launch. Everyone did. the crimsoned gown, on the paused. Yes, he came inside. She hadn't told him to, but she hadn't told him not to. And there was something in both of them that understood the geography of this conversation required proximity. I've been trying to figure out what to say to you, he said. For about 2 years, you've been occupied. Vivienne, not a rebuke. Her name in full, the way he said it when something was real. I made a choice 2 years ago based on obligation and fear and my mother's counsel and the architecture of a life that had been built for me before I was old enough to have a say in it. He stopped, steadied himself, and I have been paying for it in a way I did not anticipate. She set down her work. What do you want, Percy? A conversation we've never had. Not around things. Not carefully. His voice lowered. I want to know if there is anything left. And I want to know it before I say anything else. Because if the answer is no, and you have every reason for it to be no, then I will leave, and I will mean it. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, London carried on its enormous, indifferent life. Inside, in a room full of cloth and lamplight, and the smell of her father's work, Vivienne Courbet made a calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the thing she had been trying not to name since the moment he'd turned at the altar. There's something left, she said, quietly, precisely, but I'm not who I was 2 years ago. And if you come back into my life, Percy, you come into it as it is. Not as something quiet and convenient. My work, my name, my terms. I know. He looked at her. That's what I'm asking for. And for the first time in 2 years, neither of them looked away. 18 months later, the Corbett house opened its first flagship on Bond Street. The invitation read, You are invited to the opening of Corbett, established on the belief that clothing is the truest architecture of the self. Founded by Vivienne Courbet. Not in association with. Not in partnership with. Not presented by. Founded by. Her name, her house, her label. Dorothea Wyndham came in the first car again. She bought 3 pieces and told no fewer than 4 journalists exactly who had made them. Mara had been made creative director. Harriet Alderton had joined as cultural editor and written a piece for the Imperial Review that had generated more correspondence than any article in the magazine's history. Cecily Ford, she had returned to her own name, had sent flowers and a note. I told you so. Vivienne had laughed, which was not something she had expected to do at the sight of that handwriting. Percy arrived not at the opening but afterward, when the press had gone and the champagne had been cleared, and only the people who genuinely wanted to be there remained. He came in with the ease of someone who had been welcomed through a door, often enough that he no longer doubted it would open. He handed her a slim paper bag, inside, a first edition of collected Victorian botanical drawings, the exact volume she had been reading the night in the Norringham Library. I've been looking for it for a year, he said. You didn't tell me. I was trying to find it myself first. She looked at the cover, then at him, the grey eyes, the particular stillness. You could have asked me to help, she said. I know. A pause, sitioned. I'm still learning that. She tucked the book against her chest. Around them, the Bond Street traffic moved past the lit windows in the ordinary way of any Tuesday evening in the city, indifferent and vast. Inside, the lamps were warm. The gowns hung in the quiet certainty of things that had taken years to complete correctly. And the woman who had built all of it from a narrow house and a borrowed sewing table, and 2 steady hands stood in the room that finally carried her, name and felt without drama or qualification that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her terms, her name, her life. Have you ever watched someone finally claim what was always theirs? Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe for more stories about women who refuse to be unnamed